starting us off bright and early with a look at some of the benchmark numbers that we've been able to put together across users that are on our software. And well, Ned Arthur back there is doing the podcasting, as you heard, and so this will be available in, what do you think, Ned, like in a week or so? 1 week? And then also, you know, we're going to go through a lot of numbers, but Lisa, you've got handouts in the back there. So if you want a copy of the numbers, and so you don't have to write these down as we go, then just talk to Lisa standing in the back after the presentation is done with. Well, we're just going to get right into this, and we're going to be looking at nursery finishing and wean-to-finish closeout information. And I wanted to show you a couple things first, just to get everybody on the same page. Comparison information. This is 2012 information, 2012 data. So these would be all the closeouts that we data scrubbed and you know, figured out threw out the bad data and made it very easy to understand. Not a lot of complication here, but a couple things that I wanted to point out. When you look at this, it's 6,000, almost 6,300 nursery closeouts, almost 7,500 finishing closeouts, and then almost 1,500 wean-to-finish closeouts. And you can see how many pigs that represents, somewhere between 12 and 14 million pigs. And this is both in the U.S. and Canada, and it's primarily Midwest in the U.S. and Western Canada. So just step one, or point one, is that this is the first time this amount of data has been captured on nursery finishing, wean-to-finish closeouts with producers using the same platform, the same software, the same business processes, the same calculations. Everything is comparable, right? This isn't pulling closeouts from different software programs. It's people who are on the MetaFarms Finishing Manager, Sales Manager software. So that everything is comparable, and there's no questions about what the calculations mean for pig days or for daily gain or feed conversion or any of that. And so, you know, this is basic 101, benchmarking 101 that we're looking at right here. So the nursery closeouts, finishing closeouts, wean-to-finish closeouts, and the SS means single stock. So what we did was pull out what is clear about wean-to-finish, which is the single stock. And then there's a whole bunch of different kinds of things which are going to require some more in-depth data analysis, having to do with double stock, triple stock, and other variations of using wean-to-finish. But for this analysis, it's just single stock, straightforward single stock wean-to-finish. Now, as you look at this, you can go down the columns and you can look at mortality, for example, daily gain, feed conversion, average daily feed intake, that ADFI, and 0.84 daily gain in the nursery, 1.8 on finishing closeouts. That's a start weight of 55 pounds and an out weight of 270. Now that's across the 60 or 7,400 closeouts. So that tells you a lot about kind of what the average is. Same thing then on wean-to-finish, looking at daily gain of 157, a mortality of 5.9. Now when you compare the two, nursery plus finishing versus wean-to-finish, mortality, for example, you'd add those numbers, right? So on the mortality numbers, you'd be looking at 3 plus 4.1. So you'd be looking at a combined 7.1% mortality versus the wean-to-finish mortality of 5.9%. Same thing is true for the feed. So on, let's say, feed per pig, you're adding those numbers. 67 pounds on the nursery, that's a 13-pound in weight, 54-pound out weight. 67 pounds per feed. Pounds of feed per pig, and then 612. So you add those two and you compare that to the wean-to-finish. Wean-to-finish, advantage on mortality and advantage on feed. So less feed used in wean-to-finish and less mortality in wean-to-finish, single stock wean-to-finish versus a nursery finisher combined. Not a lot of surprises when you look at this, when I show this data to people, most producers look at it and say, you know, that's kind of what we figure 0.85 on daily gain for nurseries, and we figure about a 1.8 daily gain on finishers, and we figure about a 1.5 to 1.6 daily gain on wean-to-finish. So these numbers make a lot of sense to producers. The biggest reaction really is, well, you know, the 292 feed conversion on finishing is, everybody thinks it's 2.6, right, or 2.5 or 2.7, and so the biggest reaction is, wow, whoa, that's I'd like to see these numbers there. And essentially, these are numbers that people believe. They really believe that this is much more representative. Of course, this is probably, you know, it's a biased sample because these are people who are using our software, but still, it's you'd say it probably doesn't represent the average across the entire industry, but it's definitely the average of maybe the you know, the better producers or more intense producers when it comes to looking at numbers and being on the software. So I thought it was kind of interesting also that when you look at things like corn costs. So this is 2012, and there's no, we don't force people to use any particular corn cost when they're putting their data in. It's really whatever comes from the feed mill on the automated imports or whatever somebody enters in for their corn cost. But generally speaking, it was very similar across the board. You know, it wasn't too far off on most of these producers, and this is what the corn cost was entered into the data for 2012, right? And I should say that we're working on the 2013 update. So our customers, users of the MetaFarms software, are going to get the 2013 closeout information, and there'll be more of them. As soon as we are sure that everybody's kind of done closing their groups, so it'll probably be into February, the people January to close groups at the, you know, the end of the year groups, and we'll be taking a look at 2013 data, and we'll be sending that out to the MetaFarms customers. But so generally, that is you know, snapshot average. Of course, that average that only kind of shows, it doesn't tell you the most important thing. The most important thing is to really look at what the distributions are, right? So the interesting thing about this, now there's a lot of data, and I'll highlight the things that I think you should pay attention to, but that's why we've got these handouts here. So what we did, first of all, just to get you oriented, we're looking at the percentile distributions. So the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile on a bunch of things. And you read across these rows, not down the columns. Because one of the things that we don't have on the finishing side that we do have on the sows is we don't have one overall ranking number, like pigs weaned per sow per year, right? We don't have that on the finishing side. So there are ways, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, about ranking closeouts across growers or by system. But what we did here was we just threw all the closeouts together, and then we looked at what is the distribution of performance in nursery closeouts, and I'll show you the finishing and the wean-to-finish as well. And so the 5th percentile, the way you interpret that is 95% of all the closeouts had a start weight above 10.9 pounds, or the other way around, 5% of the closeouts, so that's 5% of the 5,000 closeouts, 6,000 closeouts on the nursery. 5% of them had a start weight. Now this is this is the actual average wean weight moving into a nursery on 1,000 pigs or 2,000 pigs, 10.9 or 11.5, and I'll get to what some actual performance numbers are associated with start weight in just a few minutes. But basically, 10.9 to the 95th percentile at 15.4. But I want to show you something. The way you really think about this is that most of the closeouts are going to be, they're going to be in this kind of, middle section, right? So this 50th percentile tends to be the average if it's a normal distribution. So that 50th percentile would be the average, and then you can see the differences here in terms of start weight. like you'd say 12 pounds to 13.7 would get you most of the closeouts are going to be in that range. Mortality, that's at the high end, so this is bad, right? 8.9% mortality. 5% of the nursery closeouts had 8.9% or worse mortality. This is 2012, not 2013, so it doesn't really take into account PED effects if there are any. And then 5% of the closeouts had 0.6% mortality, less than 1% mortality. Again, not all that much, but mostly it's going to be clustering in between 2.3, 4.2 to 1.2 is going to get you most of what nursery mortality's range was in 2012. And interpretation of daily gain is about the same, 0.84 in the middle. There were a few that were above 1, not very many. There were a few that were below 0.6, not very many. And so that's the interpretation of the distribution on nursery closeouts. So we'll look at the same thing on finishing and wean-to-finish in just a minute. But the idea is that you have to look at each one of these numbers independently, right? Because we don't rank all the closeouts on one particular number. So when you're looking at closeouts in your own system, what you have to do is figure out kind of a report card approach to a closeout. Like, how did I put together my closeouts? Did I have better than average daily gain, better than average feed conversion, worse than average mortality? And all together, that gives you a report card. And so that approach looks like this. Don't try to read it, of course. One of our reports is a closeout summary, so what people can do is get this information, run a report, push the button, run a report, get all the closeouts for the year. Takes about 30 seconds to run that report, get all the closeouts for the year for your system, and then refer the numbers to that percentile table that I just showed you. Like, you probably can't read this, but basically in this particular closeout here, they had a 13-pound start weight, and that's 50th percentile. They had a 50-pound out weight, that's 36th percentile. The graph really shows those numbers. So that's start weight, out weight, days on feed, pounds of feed per pig, cost per pound. So that's bad. When anything below this line, which is the 50th percentile, I set it up so that's like going to school, right? So it's grading. And so anything below the 50th percentile would be, C minus, D, F. Anything above is C plus, B, A. And essentially they were a little bit above this closeout. This is one closeout in particular. The report card for that closeout, they're above the average on mortality, but average or below average on just about anything else. And so you'd grade this maybe a C, C minus, or something along those lines. But that's just an example of how you can use the percentiles to then figure out a report card. And you can do it for one closeout. You could do it for a bunch of closeouts associated with, let's say, supervisors or growers or flows or health status. And we also provide, at the company level, the company averages. And so if you're going to do a company report card, you want to use the company averages, which are going to be a little bit less variable than the individual closeout averages. But the same approach. What you can do is do a report card for your company as well as doing a report card for individual closeouts or sets of closeouts. Now, I said we'll take a look at start weight. Now, in this case, what we're doing is we're reading down the columns, right? So imagine then what we did was to take all these closeouts, and we looked at the average, we looked at the distribution and how they did percentile-wise. Now what we did was to say, okay, let's take all of the closeouts with 9 to 10 pound, and there were some, 9 to 10 pound average start weight. So that's what we're talking about now, moving 1,000 pigs, 2,000 pigs, 3,000 pigs into a nursery with an average start weight in that 1,000 pigs or 2,000 pigs of between 9 and 10 pounds. Now, there aren't that many of them. It's 99 out of 6,097, so it's not very many of them. But they exist. And then there were 237 that had an average start weight between 10 and 11 pounds. Then 780, 1,949, 1,734. So you can see that most of them averaged most of them came in at an average of 11 pounds to 15 pounds. And then you get some outliers on the high end. 15 to 16 pounds, and you've got some of these lightweights. But if you look at this, this gives you quantitative information. I mean, it's not like, wow, I never thought about this before, that the lightweight pigs, I mean, light groups that start with an average lightweight have poorer performance. And a lot of people, of course, say we don't want the 10-pound pigs. But this is really the group average, right? So this is a group average weight in. So where the entire fill is averaging between 9 and 10 pounds or between 10 and 11 pounds. And if you look at that, you can see, oops, sorry about that. You can see that these, like, for example, well, you can say, well, 4.9% mortality, but that's double the mortality of a 12-pound start weight, right? So 0.67 daily gain is, a big drop in daily gain, order of magnitude drop in daily gain compared to the 12 to 13 pound start weights. Same thing is true on feed conversion, and this is average daily feed intake. And so what you can see, it's a really clear pattern, right? The lighter weight groups of pigs have much less feed intake, that poor feed conversion, much lower daily gains, and much higher mortality. So that cluster all goes together, driven really by the start weight, right? So, why would you have these pigs? Well, that's, we can't say why people were starting pigs at that weight, but it happens, right? So we know that it happens in some cases. The interesting thing I thought also about this was that once you hit 11 pound, that 11 to 12 pound start weight, group average weight of pigs coming into a nursery, basically then it's plateau after that. I mean, in other words, at the group level, this is different than what Roger Main did in this study within the Smithfield Western operations, where they looked at wean age and follow-on performance into finishing. This is not the same thing. And they really didn't separate out, Roger didn't separate out the age versus the weight question in that study. What this shows, though, is that if you put these 1,000 pigs into a nursery and they weigh above about 11 pounds, they are generally going to perform the same compared to the pigs the groups that start with a start weight of between 13 and 14 pounds. In a nursery, they're going to do about the same performance. Yeah?
Do you have the average wean age for these groups to look at?
We've got, for some of them, not for everything. And so that's going to be kind of the sub-analysis that comes next. It's a tricky, as soon as you start to slice, you lose a lot of data. And so hopefully now 2013 we'll be able to really kind of tear into that. Plus there's some producers that just weren't worried about putting what the wean age in. If they're not using our sow system, then they actually have to enter the wean age and relative age of the pigs being moved in. Sometimes they just don't do that because it's not once they tend to see the benchmarking information and we have this conversation, then a lot of times people start to enter that information in. So that's nursery on start weight. That's the start weight effect in nurseries. Now let's take a look at days on feed, and you can see that these nurseries, the way I say it is that the nursery is really the accordion in a nursery finishing system. It's where the time gets dealt with primarily, because once they move into finishing, that time tends to be fixed. A lot of people say, well, we sell on fixed, we sell on a steady market weight, not on days on feed, but when you look at the actual data, that's absolutely not the case. It's almost all systems are really days on feed driven and vary, significantly from season by season. But in this case, if you look at this, what you've got is that you've got some nursery groups that are really short, right? The 21 to 28 day groups. And when you look at start weight, you say, well, maybe those are the real heavy pigs, the heavier pigs. Well, no, not really. Start weight doesn't really make much of a difference here. There's maybe a slight tendency that the lighter start weight pigs, they'll be on feed a little bit longer, but that's not a big difference between 13 pounds and 13.2, 12.9 out here. So you can't say it's really start weight based. It's really time based. It's driving the system. It's the logistics and the space flow weight challenges in a system, I think. So you've got some of these very short nursery groups but most of them are going to be in this 35 to 56 days. And the majority are going to be in that 42 to 56 day. No, that's, no news to any of you out here. But you can see how different the outweights are based on days on feed. And of course, that's exactly what you'd expect. The daily gains go up, the feed conversions go up, the feed intake goes up. But a lot of that, the way you interpret that is that those are growth curve effects. So basically, if you think of a growth curve as, two columns of information, they ate this much feed and they weighed this much, then what happens is the longer they're on feed, you're taking a different slice of the growth curve, right? So obviously, those pigs that are, the nurseries that are 56-day nurseries compared to the 28-day nurseries, they're going to have a higher daily gain, they're going to have a higher feed conversion, they're going to have a higher feed intake because they're taking a different slice of the growth curve. So there's nothing really big about that. But if you're comparing closeouts, you have to take into account how many days on feed. You have to control for days on feed. Ideally you control for start weight too, in order to really do a good comparison, like grower to grower, for example. But it is the biggest driver of what the results are when it comes to pulling it apart by days on feed. Another that was a complete surprise to me. Not a complete surprise, but it was a surprise, and it's consistent in finishing and wean-to-finish as well, which is that the longer they're on feed, the higher the mortality. And of course, you'd say, well, that makes sense. They're on feed. They're more days at risk, so they're going to be higher mortality. But if you just assume, kind of randomness here, that they're going to be, pigs are going to be dying at the same rate, whether they're on feed for a short amount of time or a longer amount of time. In other words, the biology of mortality isn't really all that different. If you just think about that, why would there be 4 times, that's a 4-fold increase in mortality with about a doubling in days on feed. So in other words, something else is going on. There's something else happening. The longer pigs are on feed, the higher the mortality, and it's at a higher rate than just the days on feed are telling you. I don't have an answer to that, but it's a really interesting observation. And like I said, I saw it in.
Could there be an association between the longer days on feed and health status, perhaps?
It could be, and that'll be another thing. There's so many sub-analyses here. But I'll tell you, you start to lose sample size pretty quickly the more slices you put into this data. So that's why I'm looking forward to getting the 2013 information, and we can actually pool then 2012, 2013, get bigger sample sizes and begin to pull apart some of these things. I'm not going to, obviously small numbers and all the rest, but what we did was we said, okay, well now we'll take all those closeouts and we're going to put them into categories based on mortality. So we're going to put the mortalities ranging anywhere from less than 1%, and there were 944 closeouts that had less than 1% mortality, nursery closeouts. And then at the other end, there were 206 that had more than 10% mortality. And we're going to pull that apart, and we're going to take a look at the data and see what that tells us. And I'll just give you this. The lighter start weight groups have a higher mortality. We already talked about that. The higher mortality groups have a higher feed cost per pound of gain. And so you can see, here's feed cost per pound of gain is 35 cents, basically. This was 2012. And it stays right in that, 35, 36, 37 cents feed cost per pound of gain until you get out here. You get the high mortality groups. No surprise, but here are the numbers. They are up at, 41 cent cost of gain. So you're talking about some significant, 20 to 30% increases in feed cost per pound of gain as mortality goes up in the nursery. Those high mortality groups have lower daily gain, lower feed intake, and lower feed conversion. So, it's hard to say, well, what causes what, but from a common sense standpoint, you'd say whatever is happening in these nurseries that have high mortality, it happens probably early, and it happens probably quickly. And so if you're in a nursery and if you see mortality go up early and fast, there's probably no possible way that you're going to have a better than average closeout, right, on a nursery. That's what this says. It says the nursery mortality is probably driving the detrimental effects on daily gain, probably mediated by feed intake. That's, somebody could say, well, you're over-interpreting, and I probably am, but, hey, I'm the one who's up here speaking, so I guess I can do that. But I think that's, now, what's the driving the mortality? That's health status, that's PERS, that's 2000, we'll see in 2013 whether there's a differential increase due to PED, and I don't have the answer to that yet. Although I can tell you that when we did I don't know if some of you might have seen, we did the quarterly comparison looking at the third quarter of 2013 versus the third quarter of 2012, and that was run in feedstuffs in late November. And in that analysis, nursery mortality in 2013 was up about 15% compared to 2012, which could certainly be a PED effect. And we'll be looking at the fourth quarter of 2013, fourth quarter of 2012 comparison will be coming out in late February, Feedstuffs magazine, so be watching for that. Other things about the nursery, there, not really anything. What we did was say, okay, well, let's rank on feed cost per pound of gain. Do we see anything? No, there wasn't anything that really stood out other than the kinds of things I've already talked about. How about group size? So, the group sizes go from, less than 500 pigs to over 10,000 pigs would be the typical. That's the range of groups being placed into nurseries. And across that, there wasn't any obvious pattern. I thought for sure there might be either, like maybe big nurseries, big placements would have there'd be an effect, maybe a negative effect. Small, maybe better, who knows? But no difference at all in nursery performance based on the number of pigs that were placed in a group. We've got a lot of different producers using the system. So on number of sow farms flowing into a nursery, it varied from 1, so single sow farm, 1,000 pigs into a nursery, to 26. So it went from 1 to 26. There were some producers that had 26 sow farm sources into a nursery, and you can imagine. So how does that work? You got to have small sow farms and big nurseries. So that's where you get 26 sow farm sources. Here's what blew my mind was across that when you rank them and you say nursery performance by number of sow farm sources, no difference in performance, which is completely counterintuitive and completely different than whatever all of us believe. But there was no difference. Now, the thing we couldn't do was to say, and what you'd want to do is to say, well, was that a mix of health status in those sow farm sources, or was that the same health status? Because now, with 26 sow farms, I'm just going to guess it was a mix of health status, right? But you never know. So maybe production systems are good enough that they're matching health status and flowing into nurseries, so we didn't see the difference in number of sow farm sources. But it blew my mind to see that. The other thing, in terms of numbers of fills, we went from one fill to over 20 fills, and in terms of time to fill, it's 1 day to 6 weeks is what the difference. And there were no effects when you rank on time to fill, when you rank on number of fills, when you rank on number of sow farm sources. There was no effect. I mean, we've got enough data that with 6,000 plus closeouts that I believe it. I don't understand it, but it clearly is in the data. So we'll see if that's repeated again in 2013. Okay, well let's go to finishing. Let me just check my time here.
That doesn't screw up that.
Yeah, in fact, there's probably about 30% of all the closeouts that I threw out for various reasons. And, sometimes the outliers are really interesting to look at. But the thing is, for this basic, straightforward benchmarking, you want to we don't want to have issues with, well, what about that 25%? Because there's 25, 30, 40% mortality groups in there, but which are a story in and of themselves. But I just didn't want them to kind of screw up this information. So we look at finishing, same kind of approach. I'll go a little bit quicker on this, but we're looking at wean-to-finish first, then I'll look at finishing. So with wean-to-finish, this is single stock wean-to-finish groups, benchmarking information, and percentile breakdowns going from the 10th% to the 90th percentile. And so you can see that in the wean-to-finish. Now this is you think of this as nursery plus finishing combined. So when you're looking at that, remember we saw the average mortality was about 7.1% in nursery and finishing combined, and it was 5% or 5.7% in just single stock wean-to-finish. But you can see that there are some high mortality groups and there are some low mortality groups, going from 13.9 at the 10th percentile, meaning 90% of closeouts had mortality better than that. And here you'd say, 90% of the closeouts had mortalities higher than 4.4%. The average, in this case, the percentile was 6.4%. So not quite a normal distribution. But you can see that the range in daily gains, 132 to 166. And interesting, if you look at that and you look at these percentiles, once you get to the average, right? Once you get to the 50th percentile, you go 156 to 164, 166. So it's not a big difference between the top end. That's what that says. Compared to the going down, you see you're going all the way down to 1.32 versus that 1.56. So a much bigger effect at the lower, the lower percentiles drop. That the daily gain performance drops down quickly, but doesn't ramp up at the same rate. So once you get above average, you're not going to be, extraordinarily above average. That's what this shows. Feed conversions running 282 to 245. Daily feed intakes running 383 to 4.5, and that is a big difference right there. That's a huge difference. One of the interesting things is more substandard sales in wean-to-finish versus regular finishing. You'll see that. This, keep in mind, somewhere, let's say 1.6% on average, but then you're up into the 3 to 4 to 5% subs in wean-to-finish, and that's higher than in finishing groups, which you'll see in a minute. Feed cost per ton variation. Corn cost, again, pretty amazing, really, without forcing people to put any particular corn cost in. That's what it turns out to be. So that's your distributions on wean-to-finish closeouts. And again, that's about, it's almost 1,500 closeouts. Start weight, what's the effect of start weight on wean-to-finish? Now this is it, again, a lot of numbers. You can get a copy. You just kind of think about what we're looking at here. We've got, again, we take all the wean-to-finish closeouts and then we say, let's get the group that's a 10 to 11 pound average start weight, and 11 to 12, 12 to 13. So there's fewer lightweight groups, right? There are no 9 pound or between 9 and 10 pound start weight groups in moving into wean-to-finish. Why? No idea. But there aren't. And there aren't even very many 10 to 11 pound, 33 out of 1,476. So it's mostly 11 pound or higher, and it clusters in the 12 to 15 pound start weight range, which is what, kind of what you'd expect. There's not a lot of, when you look at this, I'm just going to show you. So it's days on feed, average 167 versus 160, and that's on a 10 to 11 pound start weight versus 16 pound start weight. Not a lot of difference in days, right? Pounds of feed per pig, there's not a lot of difference there. There is difference in mortality at the lightweight, but then that kind of disappears once you get into that 12 to 13 pound range. Daily gains, if you look at the daily gains, again, those daily gains, 152 versus 157, even 161 in the heaviest, but let's just stick in here. 152 versus 158. If you remember, the differences in the nursery closeouts were much bigger than the differences in the wean-to-finish In other words, we don't see the same amount of negative effect of lightweight pigs, lighter pigs, on daily gain, or feed conversion, or even feed intake. I mean, feed intake runs from 4 in the lightest weight up to 4.22. But, you know, it's not a big difference. So my conclusion about that is, I don't know why this is happening, but there's something that is protective about moving pigs into single stock wean to finish versus a nursery then into a finisher. I don't know what it is, but clearly there is some protective effect. I mean, there's something that minimizes the effect of lighter start weights, for example, in wean to finish, in contrast to nursery move finishing. And that's as much as I can say about it, you know, at this point. I mean, obviously there's some real meat to study in that statement right there. Days on feed, it's, you know, obviously we can just go on and on forever about this kind of thing. But again, you know, you got to look at days on feed. You got to control. I mean, in other words, you know, you got to group your closeouts by days on feed in order to understand performance. You don't want to be comparing, you know, the short days on feed versus long days on feed without taking that into account. But I would point out that again, in contrast to nursery plus finishing, it's a much more stable days on feed. In other words, there's not as much variation in days on feed in a wean to finish as there is in a nursery move finisher system. Finishing groups, okay, we'll just do this real quickly too. Same thing, we got percentiles, you read across the rows, knock down, you can use it to create a report card, but just to give you the same type of idea, you get this wide variation, of course, in start weights, because of some of the things we already talked about. Some, you know, at the 5th percentile, so 95% of the finishing closeouts, you know, which is 7,000 some, 95% had start weights above 36 pounds, and 95% or 94% had start weights less than 76 pounds. But you get this wide variation, and that's because you get the accordion effect of time in the nursery, which then, of course, the consequence is the difference in start weights going into finishing. So then you get, but the thing is, you don't get the accordion effect on the finishing side, right? You can't flex the finishing as easily as you can flex the nursery. So the finishing is much more of a fixed and rigid system. So you can see that days on feed 145, averaging about 120. Best, you know, of course, this goes along with heavier start weights. And same thing on mortality. You get this 9.2% to 1.3% big variation, 3.5% to 4% average. Daily gains run 1.52 to 2.1. Now that's on finishing, right? This is finishing closeouts, and so that's your average. That's the one people go, yeah, 1.81. That sounds about right. But you know, plenty of groups down at 1.6, 1.65, even 1.55, and then also a number of finishing closeouts that are going to be up in the 1.9, 1.95. Same pattern with feed conversions. Some bad, 3.3 to 3.4, and some, you know, excellent, 2.5 to 2.4, 2.4 to 2.5. But most are going to be in that, you know, 2.75, between 3, let's say 3.1 and 2.75 would get most of those feed conversions in finishing groups. Start weight effects. In this case, same exact pattern that we saw before, which is higher mortality in the lighter weight groups, lower daily gain. You get better feed conversion because you got a lightweight pig coming in, so you're taking a different slice of the growth curve compared to the heavier weight pigs. So there's nothing there. Feed intake 4.8 versus 5.5. Again, that's a growth curve effect more than anything else. But if you remember what those subs were running, now these are would be lightweight sales, right, to Wickman's or Lynch or something like that, right? So if you remember what those were running in the in Wean-to-Finish, they were almost double these numbers when a Wean-to-Finish system versus a finishing group closeout. So why that is, I mean, there's probably all sorts of things we could talk about, but no definitive reasons that show up in the data for that. And that's why, it's worth getting a copy of this. And of course, this is going to be posted. It's going to be Swinecast in a week, so you'll see they'll have all the slides, right, Ned? The slides are going to be there, so you can listen to me, as painful as that might be to hear me again. But you'll see the slides, and you'll be able to listen to me say these same things. Again, you got to control for days on feed. Days on feed is a big deal when you're looking at finishing closeouts for sure. And there are these differences that I had mentioned before. So, clearly there's growth curve effects by days on feed. That's the daily gains and feed conversions. But there's also effects other than just growth curve days on feed. So what you've got here is, when you look at this, the shorter groups, 2.6% mortality versus the longer groups of 140 to 150 days, 6% mortality. So that's a doubling of mortality, and it's not a doubling of days, right? It's about a 50% increase in days and a doubling of mortality. So something is going on by just keeping those pigs on feed longer. And you can see that these. You'd have to say that these are probably the shorter groups have heavier start weight. That means their daily gains are better, their feed conversions are better, and their feed intake is better. So that all kind of goes along with it. You've got to, ideally, what you want to do is take into account the start weight and the days on feed. And we've done that for our customers, where you take the groups, let's say, all pigs start at 55 pounds and are on feed for 120 days. And you know what the variation is in that group when you take them at the same start weight and the same number of days on feed? The variation is as wide as it is without taking that into account. In other words, that they don't all perform the same. It's still, you get a wide variation in mortality, wide variation in daily gain, wide variation in feed conversion, even with same start weight, same days on feed. And again, you can use these distributions. One of the things that we do for our customers is provide each row in this case, and I'm not going to go into the numbers, I'm just going to show you, is the company average, right? So the company average for daily gain, and this is actually sorted on daily gain. So a company, this is finishing, there is a company that on their closeouts, they average a 2.02 company-wide on average daily gain. And this isn't all the companies, I just took the top slice of it. But it goes 187, and it goes all the way down to about 16155, company average. So really, when you as a producer are looking at your system-wide number, what you want to do is you want to compare it to the company averages, not the individual closeout averages. And you do the same thing. Create that report card. At the company level, you can see, in this case, these are finishing groups. The way you read this is the 50th percentile. You got A and B above this, and this is C, D, and F below this. And so, they have big start weight, more feed intake, which is typical if your start weight's higher, a little bit higher cost of gain than average because start weight's higher, and then better than average, or worse than average mortality, worse than average daily gain, much worse feed conversion. So, this is a D company. This is company level. This is D, or, you might even say D minus as a report card for your company. Is it possible to rank closeouts by grower? Well, the answer is yes. And a lot of people are doing this, and of course the jury is out. Really, the question is, because it's very easy to understand, if you can bring your bottom growers up within a production system, you can bring them up to average, it's worth a lot of money. And that's just kind of pure profit drops to the bottom line. However, no one yet has been successful at that, and there's a bunch of producers that are on our system that are trying to track a bunch of stuff on site assessments and see if there's anything that either could be transferred, knowledge transfer back to the bottom 25%, or if you can decide, if you can figure out what the differences are. So far, nobody's been able to do it, and so the question is, do you just have to, exit the bottom growers, and then that raises your average. And as I said, the jury is out on that. We don't know, but it is possible to rank growers, and here's one of the ways that we've done it in collaboration with one production system, where they've got about 54 growers, and so this says site, so those are just confidentially identified. This is the number of turns, number of groups through that site, and an overall ranking, which is a weighted average of a bunch of different numbers. It's a weighted average of daily gain, feed intake, mortality, percent marketed tops, feed conversion, days on feed. But these are all the same facilities. It's all the same genetics. So those are not issues in this particular production system. And so you can see that what they've got is they've got an average outweight of 291 at the overall number one grower, same days on feed basically, and an outweight of 260 in the bottom grower. So this is the bottom, this is top, and I excluded the middle. The same facilities, same genetics, essentially same health status. 1.8% mortality at the best and 3.4% the worst. 192 daily gain best, 171 daily gain worst. 54 growers, same genetics, same health status, same facilities. 231 feed conversion, 252 on the bottom, and even feed intake differences. 446 at the top and 432 at the bottom. So yes, it's possible to rank growers. Now it's really interesting because we did this a number of times, and you use the numbers, present it back to the producer or the owner, and the management team says, I know that one grower is better than where he's ranking here, so we got to adjust the formula to make sure that grower moves up a little bit in the rankings, and same kind of thing going the other side. So it's I say you can do it, and you can, but there's a bit of an art to it as well. Here's one of the most interesting things, and I'll finish up with this. Maybe leave a little time for questions. But of course, this is kind of where we're going, I would say, with MetaFarms, and what's the next big thing that we see as relevant to producers and to improving performance, both production, biological, and financial. And that is when you look at production systems, a lot of times what you'll hear producers say is, we sell at a fixed market weight. But this is the graph, and this is real data from a production system in Iowa that you can't read the numbers, but this is 200 pounds. This is average market weight sold by closed groups. So the groups that close in January, February, March, April, May, all the way up to December. Now, has anybody seen this graph before? It's the graph of carcass weight in the industry at the macroeconomic level. That's the graph that Steve Meyer just had last week in his daily livestock report. That is the same graph, right? So are they selling at a fixed market weight? No. What are they selling at? They're selling it at fixed days on feed unintentionally. But I'll tell you what's interesting about this, and there's kind of a double whammy in a way going on here, because you can't probably see these numbers very well, but this is average days on feed, and this is average daily gain, and this is outweight, right? So in the times when you've got the highest daily gain, so that's 185, 185, 181, 188, 191, and that's October, November. That is also the time that they're longest on space. So the days on feed go up at the same time daily gains go up. So how can you not expect to see this at a macro level? Because I'll guarantee you that this pattern happens over and over again across production systems. It's not unique to this one production system. So they've got the fastest growing pigs when they're longest on space, and the slowest growing pigs when they're shortest on space. And that, I think, is true for the entire industry. And optimizing the total system weight is more than optimizing the carcass weight. So this right here, this number right here, that's 250 pounds. Now this is the average outweight on a whole bunch of closed groups in June and May, June time period, right? That's 252 pounds. So is load weight optimization, the pigs you load on a truck, relevant there? It's not relevant. They're telling, obviously, it makes no difference because you got 252 pound pigs. They're not even, in terms of relatively speaking, where they hit the grid, load weight optimization isn't relevant to production systems at those, I'm exaggerating, of course, for effect, but you know what I mean, right? It's really about optimizing space and time. So here's the way that a lot of people do it today, right? It's the brute force method, whiteboard. I've seen people, move post-it notes across walls. I've seen people move, hanging, flip chart kind of things across walls. I've seen companies with whiteboards as long as this room right here, essentially, dry erase marker and, that kind of thing. I get people nodding their heads in the audience. So it's really, I would call it brute force method of managing these three things. Really, it's flow, space, and weight, right? And that's where we see kind of the next frontier, is what can we do from a software standpoint to help this situation. Now, I'm going to give you an example about this, just to get you oriented. This is an actual group from a system in Iowa. I'm not picking on Iowa, by the way. This is just where we get the permission to use the data. But look at this. So this is just a group on feed, finishing group. They started in April 5th. 1,005 pigs started. Then there's a bunch of weeks where they were fed, and there's some pigs that died, and a bunch of other stuff, typically. And then the action begins in July at week 16, chronological week on feed. Week 16, they sell their first load. First load goes out, so top out load, 288.5, standard deviation 29.3. And, a lot of times people say, but, see what I do is I take the lights out because they're not going to perform, so I take the lights out and mix them with the first loads, and so that's why I get this big standard deviation. Well, whatever. But this pattern is true for production systems over and over again, which is that you get a differential daily gain, right? So this is the daily gain associated with the first pigs out, and that's 2.2. That's 22% of the group that was sold in the top out load. 22% of the group. And from a load standpoint, that was 187 pigs. There was a 245 pound pig on that load and a 376 pound pig on that load. This is, I'm not picking on anybody. This is what you see over and over and over again across the industry. Okay, so then next week they sold, not quite a full load out of the group. Then they came, and then they had their closeout load, right? So they sold 398 pigs in week 19 on feed, and they end the group, right? So let's just look at that for a second. So 47% of the pigs in this closeout went out at 249.7 pounds. Load weight optimization means nothing, right, in this case. So 47% of the pigs with a standard deviation 25 pounds. Who cares what the standard deviation was? They just loaded them up and they sent them out. So this is diagnostic for short space, too short a space in a finishing system, because you'd have to say that if there was a choice, they would not move these pigs for another couple of weeks, right? That would be what would be common sense. But obviously they had to move them. They're too short on space. They had to move them. So 47% go, and they're running a 158 daily gain. And I can tell you what my conclusion is after seeing all the data, all the research and all the rest of it. The only intervention that works on slow-growing pigs is time. The only intervention that works is time. So they have to stay longer. That's the only intervention that works. There's nothing else that's going to pick up 30 pounds on those pigs. Right? So now, here's what is really interesting. I mean, this says how much money did they leave on the table, right? But if you look at the closeout daily gain, that's what these numbers out here are. This is the closeout daily gain and the closeout live weight standard deviation. And the closeout daily gain is 182. That's above the 50th percentile. So a lot of people are going to look at the closeout standard deviation, they're going to look at the closeout daily gain, and they're going to say, good to go. I mean, we did well with this closeout. And they left, if you look at this, okay, can't optimize carcass weight if half the pigs are sold 30 pounds below your target. If you just calculate that out, that's $12 per pig. Now, I didn't add any additional marginal cost, but it's not going to be that much. So, okay, let's say it's $9 a pig, not $12 a pig. Doesn't matter. It's $12 on a pig on the table at this closeout. And the thing is, what you need to do, all your producers who are either on our system or are on our software or your own internal systems, is you have to figure out what % of the groups. Everybody focuses on top outs, which is good, and they focus on carcass weight optimization, loading the right pigs on the truck. That's good. But what you have to do is you have to figure out what percentage of the groups did I short side? I mean, thinking of it in terms of golf metaphor. How many did I short side? What %? Because that's where the real money is left on the table. Planned closeout profit becomes lost due to the revenue miss. And the thing is, if you've got enough lead time, even if the data is organized in a way that shows you this, that gives you a little bit more lead time, because you can't make that decision the week of August 10th. You can't make you don't have time to do anything with these pigs. Right? You got to have a little bit of lead time, maybe 3-4 weeks, and ideally it might be longer. But at least there are ways, I think, that we can help organize the data and show the flow that would help you see that this might be starting to happen. And so, you can call it logistics, you can call it challenges of space, flow, and weight, but we do think that is the frontier. Well, I'll end with that, just because time is getting short here. And I'll just, if there's a question or two, be happy to answer them. I'll be around. We've got the booth at the trade show, and happy to answer any questions. Yeah. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. Like I said, Lisa's got copies of the presentation. We'll probably trade it for a business card, and Ned's going to have this up online in another week or so you can hear it and see it again. Thanks a lot.